The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above as Elijah adjusted his tie, a simple gesture that somehow felt monumental today. There was something about the way he felt in that moment, a mix of nervous excitement and the kind of deep-seated determination that only came from knowing you were on the verge of something truly groundbreaking. You see, Elijah wasn't just any engineer. He was the kind of engineer who, from a young age, took apart his toys just to figure out how they worked, and then put them back together better than before. His mind, always a few steps ahead, had conjured an idea so innovative that it made him lose sleep at night, not out of fear, but out of sheer anticipation. He walked into the gleaming office building, his heart pounding a little harder than usual. As he stepped into the elevator, he couldn't help but replay the pitch in his mind for the 100th time. The concept was solid, revolutionary even. But as we all know, it's not always about the idea itself. Sometimes it's about who's behind it. The elevator dinged softly, pulling Elijah out of his thoughts as the door slid open to reveal the polished marble floors of the executive suite. This was it, his moment. But as he approached the conference room, his confident stride faltered ever so slightly. Doubt crept in, tiny insidious thoughts that whispered, "What if they don't see the potential? What if they only see you?" Shaking it off, Elijah took a deep breath, reminding himself of his credentials, his accomplishments, and the countless hours he poured into perfecting this idea. He was ready. The door to the conference room was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, the CEO's voice filled the room. "Let's make this quick," the CEO said, not bothering to look up from his tablet as Elijah entered. A tall man with graying hair and an air of impatience, the CEO was known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. His decisions were swift, his opinions unyielding, and as Elijah would soon find out, his biases, well, those were just as strong. Elijah offered a polite smile as he greeted the room, his eyes quickly scanning the faces around the table. The usual suspects were there, the CTO, the head of product development, a few other executives, but none of them seemed particularly interested in what Elijah had to say. They were here out of obligation, not curiosity. "Thank you for your time," Elijah began, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension in the room. He launched into his presentation, his words flowing effortlessly as he described the concept that had consumed his thoughts for months. It was an idea that could revolutionize the industry, a game-changer in every sense of the word. But as he spoke, he couldn't help but notice the CEO's disinterested gaze, the way his fingers tapped impatiently on the table, as if counting down the seconds until this meeting was over. And then it happened. The moment Elijah had dreaded but hoped against. CEO, with a dismissive wave of his hand, cut him off mid-sentence. "We've heard enough," he said, his tone clipped and final. "This isn't the direction we're going in." Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned by the abruptness of the rejection. He had expected questions, maybe even skepticism, but not this, not outright dismissal without so much as a second glance at the potential. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain further, but the CEO had already turned his attention back to his tablet, the meeting already forgotten in his mind. "Thank you, Elijah," the CTO interjected, a forced smile on his face as he gently ushered him towards the door. "We'll keep this in mind for future reference." Future reference. Elijah knew what that meant. It was corporate speak for "don't call us, we'll call you." The kind of brush-off that leaves you standing in the hallway, wondering what just happened. As he walked out of the conference room, the door clicking shut behind him, Elijah felt the weight of disappointment settle on his shoulders. But beneath that, there was something else, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let this rejection define him or his idea. He had poured too much into this to just walk away now. What was it about Elijah, you ask, that made him so certain he was onto something big? It wasn't arrogance, but rather a deep, instinctual understanding of his craft. Elijah had grown up in a world that constantly underestimated him, a world that expected him to fail, and yet he had always found a way to rise above it, to push boundaries and defy expectations. This time would be no different. You know, there's something interesting about moments like these. They have a way of bringing everything into sharp focus. Elijah could see the path ahead of him clearly now, not the easy road, but the right one. The one where he would prove them all wrong. And if you've ever been in a situation where someone just didn't see your potential, you know exactly how that feels. It's frustrating, isn't it? Like being handed a blank sheet of paper when you've already painted a masterpiece in your mind. Less than break time equals 1.0 / greater than, but that's the thing about masterpieces. They take time, and sometimes the world just isn't ready for them yet. But Elijah, he wasn't about to wait around for the world to catch up. He left that office building with a renewed sense of purpose, his mind already buzzing with plans. He would refine his idea, make it so undeniable that they would have no choice but to recognize its value. And if they didn't, well, he'd find someone who would. And here's where it gets interesting, because when you've got something truly valuable, something that can change the game, it doesn't matter how many times you get knocked down. What matters is how many times you get back up. Over the next few weeks, Elijah threw himself into his work like never before. He spent long nights at his desk, fueled by coffee and sheer determination. Every setback was met with a new solution, every doubt with renewed confidence. He reached out to old colleagues, connected with industry experts, and slowly, piece by piece, his idea began to take shape in ways even he hadn't anticipated. But the world around him, well, it wasn't exactly cheering him on. There were whispers in the office, the kind that start small but grow louder with each passing day. People doubted him, questioned his sanity for continuing to pursue something that had been so thoroughly rejected. Even his closest friends gently suggested that maybe it was time to move on, to focus on other projects that were more likely to gain traction. Ever been in that situation where everyone around you thinks you're just chasing a dream? Like you're the only one who sees the potential, the only one who understands that you're not just chasing a dream, you're building a reality. Less than break time equals 0.5s / greater than, that's where Elijah was, standing at the intersection of doubt and determination, knowing that turning back wasn't an option. And here's the thing about doubt. It's sneaky. It doesn't just announce itself at your door. It creeps in, one little thought at a time, until suddenly you're standing in the middle of a storm you didn't even see coming. But Elijah, he was ready for the storm. He had weathered them before, and he knew how to navigate through this one. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Elijah's idea, once just a collection of thoughts and sketches, had evolved into something tangible, something real. He had found a small but dedicated team who believed in his vision as much as he did, and together they worked tirelessly to bring it to life. There were setbacks, of course, aren't there always? Technical issues, funding problems, the occasional sleepless night where everything seemed to be falling apart. But each time Elijah and his team found a way to push through, and with each challenge they overcame, the idea grew stronger, more refined. And then, one day, it happened. That moment that every inventor, every creator dreams of, the breakthrough. It was as if all the pieces had suddenly fallen into place, like a puzzle that had been frustratingly incomplete for far too long. The idea was no longer just an idea. It was a fully formed innovation, ready to take the world by storm. Elijah couldn't help but smile as he looked at what they had created. This was it, the culmination of months of hard work, late nights, and unwavering belief in something that everyone else had dismissed. And now, well, now it was time to show the world. Isn't it funny how life works sometimes? The very thing that the CEO had rejected so casually was about to become the next big thing. and there was no stopping it. Less than break time equals 1.0 / greater than Elijah had no intention of rubbing it in their faces. He was too focused on the future, on the possibilities that lay ahead. But he couldn't deny the satisfaction that came with knowing he had been right all along. And as for the CEO, well, let's just say that some lessons are learned the hard way. But we'll get to that. For now, let's just enjoy the moment of victory, shall we? Because there's something incredibly powerful about proving the naysayers wrong, about standing tall when everyone else expected you to fall. Elijah left the boardroom with a stiff nod, his heart pounding in his chest, a rhythm that mirrored the nagging thoughts swirling in his head. He could feel the weight of every sideways glance, every smirk hidden behind polite nods, as he made his way back to his desk. The rejection wasn't just a dismissal of his idea. It felt personal, a reminder of every door that had ever slammed shut in his face because of who he was and not what he could do. He sat down, the hum of the office buzzing around him, but all he could hear was the echo of the CEO's words. "This isn't the direction we're going in." It was as if those words had been etched into his mind, replaying over and over again, each time a little sharper, a little more painful. He tried to focus on his work, to drown out the noise with the familiar comfort of codes and algorithms, but it was no use. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind stuck in that boardroom, still grappling with the rejection. "Hey man, don't take it too hard," a voice said, snapping Elijah out of his thoughts. It was Malik, one of the few colleagues who had always been supportive. Malik was the kind of guy who could find humor in any situation, even the most frustrating ones. But today, even his usual lightheartedness seemed forced. "Yeah," Elijah muttered, forcing a smile. "I'm fine." "Fine?" Malik raised an eyebrow, leaning against Elijah's desk. "You just got shot down by the big boss himself. I mean, that's got to sting a little, right?" Elijah shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. But the truth was written all over his face. It wasn't just the sting of rejection. It was the bitterness of knowing that if someone else, someone who didn't look like him, had presented the same idea, the response might have been different. But saying that out loud, well, that was another story. Malik, sensing the unspoken tension, sighed and patted Elijah on the shoulder. "Look, don't let it get to you. They don't see what you see doesn't mean it's not there." Elijah nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but finding little comfort in it. How many times had he heard that before? How many times had he been told to just keep his head down, to not let it get to him? It was easy advice to give when you weren't the one being constantly overlooked, constantly doubted. As the day dragged on, Elijah tried to bury himself in his work, but the words on the screen blurred together, his thoughts elsewhere. He kept replaying the pitch in his mind, trying to pinpoint where he had gone wrong, what he could have said differently to make them see the potential. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about the pitch. It wasn't about the idea. It was about him. Ever had that feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, but no one else seems to notice? Like you're constantly fighting an uphill battle, and every step forward feels like a victory, but no one's around to celebrate it with you. That was where Elijah was now, stuck in a loop of self-doubt and frustration, the walls of the office closing in on him as the hours ticked by. By the time he left the office, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the empty streets. Elijah walked home, the cool evening air doing little to clear his mind. He knew he couldn't just let this go. He couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. But what could he do? He was just one man, up against a system that had been designed to keep people like him in their place. But then again, wasn't that always the story? The story of every person who had ever dared to defy the odds, who had ever refused to be defined by the limitations others placed on them. Elijah had always been a fighter, always been the kind of person who didn't back down in the face of adversity. And this time would be no different. By the time he reached his apartment, Elijah had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this rejection be the end of the story. He was going to keep working on his idea, even if it meant doing it in secret, even if it meant burning the midnight oil until there was nothing left. Because deep down, he knew that this idea was too important, too revolutionary to just let it fade away. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the office early, his resolve steeled, his mind clear. He kept his head down, focused on his work, but as soon as the clock struck noon and the office began to empty for lunch, he got to work on his real project. At first, it was just small tweaks, refining the code, making adjustments that would push his idea closer to perfection. But as the days turned into weeks, his project grew into something more, something that consumed every spare moment he had. He stayed late into the night, long after everyone else had gone home. The only sound in the office was the soft tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. There was something almost therapeutic about it, the way the hours melted away as he lost himself in the work. Here, in the quiet solitude of the office after hours, Elijah could forget about the rejection, forget about the doubts and the whispers. Here it was just him and his idea, a battle of wills that he was determined to win. But as much as he tried to keep his work under wraps, it wasn't long before Malik caught on. One night, long after most of the lights had been turned off, Malik strolled past Elijah's desk, a takeout container in hand. He paused, frowning as he noticed Elijah still hunched over his computer, the screen glowing with lines of code. "Jude, you're still here?" Malik asked, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. Elijah looked up, blinking as he tried to refocus. "Yeah, just working on something." "Ha ha." Malik pulled up a chair, sitting down across from Elijah. "And I'm guessing this something isn't exactly part of your job description, is it?" Elijah hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He hadn't meant for anyone to find out, at least not yet. But Malik wasn't just anyone. He was a friend, one of the few people in the office who had always had his back. "I'm not letting it go," Elijah said finally, his voice steady. "I can't." Malik studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You know you're playing with fire, right? If they find out you're working on this—" "They won't," Elijah cut in, a hint of defiance in his voice. "I'm careful." "Careful?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "You're practically living in this office, man. Sooner or later, someone's going to notice." Elijah shrugged, his resolve unwavering. "Let them. I'm not doing anything wrong. This is my idea, my work. If they don't want to see the potential in it, that's their problem. But I'm not going to stop just because they can't see what's right in front of them." Malik sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're a stubborn guy, you know that." Elijah smiled, the first real smile he'd had in days. "Yeah, I've been told that before." "Well," Malik said, leaning back in his chair, "if you're going to keep this up, you might as well let me help. 2 heads are better than 1, right?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I could use the help." And so, with Malik by his side, Elijah's project began to take on a new life. They worked together, late into the night, their ideas bouncing off each other, the project growing more ambitious with each passing day. It was hard work, exhausting at times, but there was something exhilarating about it too, something that made the long hours worth it. But of course, nothing stays secret forever. It wasn't long before the whispers started again, this time with a new edge of curiosity, of suspicion. People noticed the late nights, the way Elijah and Malik seemed to be working on something that wasn't quite in line with their usual tasks. There were questions, raised eyebrows, but no one said anything outright. At least, not yet. Then came the day when the CTO, Mr. Daniels, called Elijah into his office. Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he made his way down the hall, the familiar dread creeping in. He had been careful, so careful, but had it been enough? Mr. Daniels didn't waste any time. As soon as Elijah walked in, he gestured for him to sit down, his expression unreadable. "Elijah, I've been hearing some interesting things lately." Elijah forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady. "Interesting how?" "There are rumors," Mr. Daniels continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "that you've been working on something off the books." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've been working on my usual projects, just like everyone else." Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah closely. "You're a smart guy, Elijah, one of the best we've got. But I need to know, are these rumors true?" Elijah sat there for a moment, letting the silence stretch out in Mr. Daniels' office. It was one of those moments where time seems to slow down, where every second feels like an eternity. You know, the kind where you're not sure whether to speak up or just let the silence do the talking. Finally, he decided to go with his gut, a gut that had rarely led him astray, even if it had gotten him into a few tight spots over the years. "I don't know what you've heard," Elijah repeated, keeping his tone steady, "but I'm focused on my work here." Mr. Daniels nodded, but his eyes told a different story, one of suspicion, and perhaps even a hint of curiosity. "That's good to hear," he said, though it sounded more like a warning than a compliment. "Just make sure it stays that way." Elijah forced a smile, though inside he could feel the tension coiling tighter, like a spring ready to snap. He left the office with a polite nod, but as soon as he was back at his desk, his mind was already racing ahead. He needed to be more careful, yes, but he also needed to push forward. There was too much at stake to back down now. That night, after everyone had gone home, Elijah stayed behind, staring at his computer screen. The glow from the monitor was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the walls. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder, more persistent. Elijah rubbed his eyes, trying to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Mr. Daniels. "What if they're watching me?" he thought, a shiver running down his spine. But then he shook his head, banishing the thought. So what if they are? Let them watch. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just working on something that should have been theirs to begin with. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and early mornings. Elijah worked tirelessly, refining every aspect of his idea, tweaking the design, rewriting code, testing and retesting until he was sure it was perfect, or as close to perfect as he could get. Every challenge, every obstacle that came his way, only served to fuel his determination. When the code wouldn't compile, he stayed up until dawn, picking it apart line by line until he found the problem. When a piece of hardware failed, he tore it down and rebuilt it from scratch. And when exhaustion threatened to overtake him, he pushed it aside, telling himself that sleep could wait. But it wasn't just about the work. It was about proving something, not just to the people who had rejected him, but to himself. He wanted to show that he could do it, that he could take this idea that everyone else had dismissed and turn it into something real, something that mattered. He wanted to prove that he was more than just another cog in the machine, more than just another engineer working in the shadows of people who didn't see his worth. In the midst of all this, something interesting started to happen. Elijah began to notice things, small things, the kind that most people would overlook. A glitch in a program that led to a new feature. A mistake in a blueprint that sparked an idea for a more efficient design. It was as if the very act of pushing himself to his limits was unlocking a new level of creativity, a new way of seeing the world. But of course, resilience alone isn't enough. Even the most determined person can only get so far on their own. And as much as Elijah hated to admit it, he needed help. Malik was already in the loop, his sharp mind and easygoing nature making him the perfect partner for those long nights of brainstorming and problem-solving. But they needed more than just the two of them. One evening, as they were packing up to leave the office, another night spent burning the midnight oil, Malik turned to Elijah and said, "You know, we could really use someone with more hardware expertise. I mean, we're doing okay, but we're not exactly experts when it comes to building stuff from scratch." Elijah nodded, though the thought of bringing someone else in made him uneasy. It wasn't that he didn't trust Malik's judgment, quite the opposite, in fact. But the more people involved, the greater the risk of getting caught. "Yeah, I know," Elijah said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But who? We can't just ask around, not without raising suspicions." Malik grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Actually, I might know someone." That's how they ended up in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the music is loud, the drinks are cheap, and no one asks too many questions. Malik had arranged a meeting with an old friend of his, a hardware engineer named Sophia, who had a reputation for being brilliant but a bit of a wild card. When Sophia arrived, she was everything Elijah had imagined, sharp, quick-witted, with a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put him at ease. She listened intently as they explained the project, her eyes lighting up with interest as they laid out their plans. "So, what do you think?" Malik asked, leaning back in his chair with a grin. Sophia took a sip of her drink, considering for a moment before she spoke. "I think you two are either insane or geniuses. Maybe both." She set her glass down with a decisive thud. "I'm in." With Sophia on board, the project took on a new energy. She brought a level of expertise that neither Elijah nor Malik could match, and her enthusiasm was infectious. The three of them made a formidable team, each bringing something different to the table, each pushing the others to be better, to think bigger. The late nights grew even later, the challenges even greater, but the progress they made was undeniable. There were moments of frustration, of course, times when it felt like they were banging their heads against a wall, unable to find a solution. But there were also moments of triumph, those flashes of brilliance when everything clicked into place, when the impossible suddenly seemed within reach. One night, as they were working on the final prototype, Elijah found himself staring at the device in front of him, a mixture of awe and disbelief washing over him. It was a small thing, really, just a piece of hardware, a tangle of wires and circuits, but it represented so much more. It was proof that they had done it, that they had taken an idea that everyone else had dismissed and turned it into something real, something tangible. He looked up to find Malik and Sophia watching him, their expressions a mirror of his own. They didn't need to say anything. Their shared sense of accomplishment was enough. But there was still a long way to go, still so much to do before they could even think about showing this to the world. "Are we ready?" Elijah asked, though he already knew the answer. Malik grinned, clapping him on the back. "Ready as we'll ever be." Sophia nodded, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Let's do this." They spent the next few days putting the finishing touches on the prototype, tweaking and refining until they were sure it was perfect. Every detail, every line of code, every connection had been checked and rechecked, tested and retested until there was nothing left to fix. But as they prepared for the final test, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. It was that nagging doubt, that voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "Asterisk, what if it's not enough? What if all this work was for nothing?" Asterisk. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand, but it lingered, a shadow on the edge of his thoughts. The night of the final test, the three of them gathered in the small workshop they had set up in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place to work in secret, far from prying eyes, and it had become their sanctuary, a place where they could let their ideas run wild without fear of judgment. The air was thick with anticipation as they powered up the prototype, the soft hum of the machinery filling the room. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the device come to life, his eyes glued to the screen in front of him. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, had led to this moment. But as the seconds ticked by, nothing happened. The screen remained blank, the device silent. Elijah's heart sank as he stared at the unresponsive machine, his mind racing. What went wrong? Had they missed something? Was there a flaw in the design? Or was it something more fundamental, something that couldn't be fixed? Malik cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. What the hell happened? It was working fine last night. Sophia frowned, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to diagnose the problem. I don't know. Everything seems fine on my end. It should be working. Elijah felt a wave of frustration wash over him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. All that work, all those late nights, and for what? To watch it fail at the final hurdle. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But just as the despair threatened to take hold, a thought flashed through his mind. Something he had overlooked, something so simple that it seemed almost ridiculous. He stepped forward, taking the device in his hands and flipping a small switch on the side. There was a moment of silence, and then it worked. The device hummed to life, a soft glow emanating from the screen as lines of code scrawled across it. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. It worked. After all the late nights, the doubts, the setbacks, they had finally done it. But before he could fully bask in the victory, a new thought crept in. What no? Sophia let out a whoop of triumph, clapping Elijah on the back. I knew it. I knew you'd figure it out. Her voice was filled with excitement, but Elijah could hear the exhaustion behind it. They were all running on fumes at this point, the adrenaline from the breakthrough only masking how drained they really were. Malik grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, I was about ready to smash this thing with a hammer. Good thing you figured it out when you did. He chuckled, but there was an edge to it, a hint of the frustration they'd all been feeling. Elijah forced a smile, nodding along with them, but his mind was already racing ahead. They had cleared this hurdle, sure, but there were still so many more to come. And the further they went, the higher the stakes became. It was thrilling, yes, but it was also terrifying. The kind of terror that sinks into your bones and doesn't let go. The next morning, Elijah sat in his office, staring at the device on his desk. It was strange, really, how something so small could carry so much. Wait, it wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a symbol of everything they'd fought for, everything they'd sacrificed. But it was also a reminder of how much they still had to lose. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the door opening until Mr. Daniels walked in, his expression as unreadable as ever. Elijah tensed, quickly moving to cover the device with some papers, but Mr. Daniels had already seen it. "What's that?" Mr. Daniels asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Elijah's mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, but nothing seemed plausible. Instead, he opted for the truth, or at least a version of it. "Just a side project," he said, forcing a smile. "Something I've been working on in my spare time." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "A side project, huh? And how much of your spare time is it taking up?" Elijah shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Not much. Just something to keep me busy after hours." Mr. Daniels studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Just be careful, Elijah. I wouldn't want to see you get in over your head." With that, he turned and left, leaving Elijah to sit there, heart pounding in his chest. In over my head. Was that a warning or something else? Elijah couldn't be sure, but the encounter left him feeling uneasy. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change that he couldn't quite put his finger on. But whatever it was, it didn't feel good. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Elijah tried to focus on the work, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. And then, just as things were starting to fall into place, they did. It started with a phone call, one that came late in the evening, as Elijah was packing up to leave the office. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer it anyway. As soon as he heard the voice on the other end, his heart sank. Elijah, the voice said, heavy with emotion. It was his sister Maya, and she sounded like she'd been crying. Elijah, it's Mom. She's in the hospital. Elijah felt the world tilt beneath him, the floor seeming to drop out from under his feet. What? What happened? She had a stroke, Maya said, her voice trembling. It's bad, Elijah. The doctors, they're not sure that she's going to make it. Elijah didn't remember much of what happened after that. He must have said something, promised to be there as soon as he could. But his mind was already a blur of panic and fear. He grabbed his things and left the office in a daze, barely aware of the people around him as he rushed to the hospital. When he arrived, the sterile smell of the hospital hit him like a punch to the gut. He found Maya in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn, and the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Their mother was still alive, but just barely. The next few days were a nightmare. Elijah spent every moment he could at the hospital, sitting by his mother's bedside, watching as the machines kept her alive. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and fear, guilt that he hadn't been there when it happened, fear of what might happen next. He couldn't concentrate on anything else, couldn't think about work or the project or anything but the fragile figure lying in that hospital bed. Malik and Sophia kept things going in his absence, but Elijah knew that they were struggling. Without him there to lead the way, the project was stalling. But every time he thought about going back to work, the guilt would crash over him like a wave. How could he focus on anything else when his mother was fighting for her life? And then, just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Elijah returned home to find a letter waiting for him. It was from the bank, and as soon as he opened it, his heart sank. It was a notice of foreclosure. Unless he came up with the money to pay off his overdue mortgage, he was going to lose his house. It was like the universe had decided to throw everything at him all at once. His mother was in the hospital, his finances were in ruins, and his project, the one thing that had been keeping him going, was teetering on the edge of collapse. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of everything pulling him under, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could keep going. But then he thought about his mother, about how she had always been there for him, always believed in him, even when no one else did. She had worked so hard to give him the opportunities she never had, and had sacrificed so much to make sure he could succeed. And now it was his turn to be strong, to fight for her the way she had always fought for him. Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. He had to keep going, had to push through, no matter how hard it was. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore, was doing it for his mother, for the future she had always dreamed of for him. He threw himself back into the project with a renewed sense of determination, working long hours at the hospital and even longer hours at home. Malik and Sophia were there every step of the way, offering their support, but Elijah could tell that they were starting to worry. He was pushing himself to the brink, and they could see it even if he couldn't. "Man, you need to take a break," Malik said one evening, his voice filled with concern. "You're going to burn yourself out." Elijah shook his head, his eyes bloodshot and tired. "I can't. Not now. We're so close. I can't stop now." Sophia nodded in agreement, but there was a hint of unease in her expression. "We get it, Elijah. We're all in this together. But you've got to take care of yourself too. If you don't, you won't be any good to anyone." Elijah knew they were right, but the thought of stopping, even for a moment, was unbearable. There was too much at stake, too much riding on this project. He couldn't let them down, couldn't let his mother down. But as the days wore on, the toll it was taking on him became impossible to ignore. He was exhausted, barely sleeping, barely eating, his mind a constant billow of work and worry. And then, just as it seemed like they were on the verge of a breakthrough, disaster struck. It happened late one night as they were running the final test on the prototype. Everything was going smoothly, the device functioning perfectly, until it wasn't. There was a sudden violent spark, and the next thing they knew, the prototype was up in flames. Elijah stared in horror as the fire consumed the device, his heart sinking as he watched all their hard work go up in smoke. Malik and Sophia scrambled to put out the flames, but by the time it was over, there was nothing left but a charred smoking mess. For a moment, the three of them just stood there, staring at the remains of the prototype in stunned silence. And then the reality of what had just happened hit Elijah like a ton of bricks. All those late nights, all that effort, and it was all gone. Elijah. Malik's voice was soft, cautious, as if he were afraid that saying anything louder might break him. It's okay. We'll figure something out. But Elijah couldn't hear him. All he could think about was the endless hours they'd spent working on this, the countless sacrifices they'd made, and how it had all led to this, a pile of ashes and a dream that was slipping through his fingers. Elijah walked out of the workshop, leaving the smouldering ruins of his dream behind him. His steps were heavy, each one feeling like a weight dragging him further down into the depths of despair. The night air was cool against his skin, but it did nothing to clear the fog in his mind. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that devastating scene. The streets were quiet, city lights casting long shadows on the pavement as he walked. His thoughts were a jumble of frustration, anger, and overwhelming sadness. How had everything gone so wrong? They had been so close, so damn close to making this work, and now it was all gone, burned to ashes right in front of his eyes. Ever had one of those days where it feels like the universe is just out to get you? Like no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, everything just keeps falling apart. That was where Elijah was now, caught in the middle of a storm with no idea how to find his way out. Less than break time equals 1.0 / greater than he found himself at the edge of the river that ran through the city, the water dark and still under the night sky. He sat down on a bench, staring out at the water, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Should he keep going? Was it even worth it anymore? Every time he thought they were making progress, something else went wrong, dragging them back down into the muck. And then there was his mother. She was still in the hospital, still fighting for her life, and every day that went by felt like a countdown he couldn't stop. He wanted to be there for her, to spend every moment by her side, but he couldn't ignore the fact that his project, their project, was falling apart. How could he balance both? How could he keep pushing forward when everything around him was crumbling? Ever felt like you're being pulled in two directions at once? Like no matter which way you turn, you're going to let someone down. That's where Elijah was, caught between his obligation to his mother and his drive to see this project through. He could feel the weight of both pulling him down, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. He ran a hand through his hair, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside his head. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe this was a sign that he was pushing too hard, trying to force something that wasn't meant to be. But the thought of giving up, of walking away after everything they'd been through, it was almost unbearable. And then, as he sat there, staring out at the water, he remembered something his mother had told him years ago, when he was just a kid, struggling to keep up with his schoolwork. She looked him in the eye, her voice firm, but full of love, and said, "Elijah, nothing worth having comes easy. If you want something bad enough, you've got to fight for it. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how many times you fall down, you've got to get back up and keep going. He could almost hear her voice now, echoing in his mind, giving him the strength he needed to face the truth. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Yes, they hit a major setback, but that didn't mean it was over. They still had a chance to make this work, to prove everyone wrong. He just had to find a way to keep going, to push through the pain and the doubt and the fear. With a renewed sense of determination, Elijah stood up, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't going to let this defeat him. He was going to go back to that workshop, rebuild what they'd lost, and make it even better than before. He was going to fight for this, just like his mother had taught him. The next morning, Elijah walked into the workshop with a new sense of purpose. Malik and Sophia were already there, their faces lined with exhaustion and worry. But when they saw the look in Elijah's eyes, they knew something had changed. "We're not done," Elijah said, his voice steady and resolute. "We're going to rebuild this, and we're going to make it better than before." Malik exchanged a glance with Sophia, then nodded slowly. "I'm with you, man, whatever it takes." Sophia smiled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Let's do this." The three of them got to work, salvaging what they could from the wreckage and starting from scratch where they had to. It was grueling, exhausting work, but there was a renewed sense of camaraderie between them, a shared determination that kept them going through the toughest moments. But just as things seemed to be getting back on track, something unexpected happened. One evening, as they were wrapping up for the night, Malik received a phone call. He stepped outside to take it, and when he returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" Elijah asked, concern lacing his voice. Malik shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's my cousin Jamal. He was arrested." "What?" Sophia's eyes widened in shock. "For what?" Malik swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're saying he was involved in a robbery, but it's not true. He was just walking home from work." Elijah felt a surge of anger rise up inside him. He knew all too well how easily the system could turn against someone, especially someone like Jamal, someone who looked like them. "We need to do something," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "We can't just let this happen." But what could they do? The system was stacked against them, and the odds of getting Jamal out were slim to none. Still, they couldn't just sit by and do nothing. They spent the next few days doing everything they could to help, reaching out to lawyers, rallying support, but the situation only seemed to get worse. The stress of it all began to take its toll on Malik, and Elijah could see it in the way he worked. His usual sharpness dulled by worry, his energy drained by the constant fear of what might happen to his cousin. And as much as Elijah wanted to keep pushing forward with the project, he knew they were at a crossroads. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. They were all on edge, their nerves frayed by the constant pressure, the never-ending setbacks. But there was something else too, something Elijah couldn't quite put his finger on. A sense that things were about to come to a head, that they were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of something big, or something disastrous. Less than break time equals 1.0 / greater than it all came to a head one night when they were working late in the workshop. The air was thick with the smell of solder and the hum of machinery as they worked on the final touches of the rebuilt prototype. But despite their best efforts, something was off. The device wasn't responding the way it should, the code glitching in ways they couldn't predict or control. Sophia let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing her temples. "This doesn't make any sense. We've gone over everything 100 times. It should be working." Malik nodded, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Maybe there's something we're missing, something we're not seeing." Elijah frowned, staring at the screen, his mind racing. What if they were looking at this all wrong? What if the solution wasn't in the code, but in the way they were approaching it? He took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind, to think outside the box. And then it hit him. A possibility so simple, so obvious, that it almost seemed ridiculous. But what if? What if they were overcomplicating things? What if the key to making this work was to strip it down to its most basic components, to simplify the design instead of adding more layers? He hesitated for a moment, then turned to Malik and Sophia, his heart pounding in his chest. What if we're overthinking this? What if the answer is to make it simpler, not more complex? They both stared at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. Simpler, Sophia echoed, her brow furrowed in thought. How? Elijah quickly sketched out his idea, explaining how they could streamline the design, remove unnecessary components, and focus on the core functionality. It was a risk, sure, but at this point they didn't have much to lose. Malik and Sophia exchanged a glance, then nodded in unison. "Let's do it," Malik said, his voice filled with determination. "We've come this far. We might as well see it through." They spent the next few hours reworking the prototype, stripping away the extraneous elements and refining it to its simplest, most essential form. It was painstaking work, every decision a gamble, every change a potential disaster. But as the night wore on, they began to see the pieces falling into place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they were ready for the final test. The air in the workshop was thick with anticipation as they powered up the device, holding their breath as they waited to see if it would work. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, but then it happened. The device hummed to life, its soft glow filling the workshop with a quiet sense of triumph. Elijah, Malik, and Sophia exchanged relieved glances, the tension that had gripped them for so long finally starting to ease. It wasn't just the hum of success they were hearing. It was the sound of validation of all, those sleepless nights and grueling setbacks finally paying off. For the first time in what felt like forever, things were looking up. But, as life often likes to remind us, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. That sense of triumph was short-lived, fading into a gnawing unease that crept up on Elijah in the days that followed. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way Malik had started avoiding his gaze, or the way Sophia had grown unusually quiet. But the sense of camaraderie that had once bound them together was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. One evening, after another long day of testing, Elijah lingered in the workshop after Malik and Sophia had left. He sat there in the dim light, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't quite pin down. It was like trying to hold on to water, slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to grasp it. As he stared at the device on the workbench, a sudden thought struck him. A memory, really from just a few days ago. He remembered seeing Malik talking to someone outside the workshop. It hadn't seemed important at the time, just a casual conversation, but now it gnawed at him, the way Malik had glanced around, the way he'd ended the conversation abruptly when he noticed Elijah approaching. Why would Malik be so secretive? Elijah wondered, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. He'd always trusted Malik, relied on him like a brother in this fight. But now he wasn't so sure. What if there was something he didn't know, something lurking just beneath the surface? Elijah pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was being paranoid. Malik was his friend, his partner in this endeavor. They'd been through too much together for there to be any secrets between them, right? But that sinking feeling only deepened the next day when Elijah received an email from the company's legal department. The subject line alone was enough to send a jolt of fear through him. URGENT. Intellectual property. Inquiry. His heart pounded as he opened the email, his eyes scanning the contents in disbelief. They were asking about the device, questioning its origins, its design. They wanted to know who had worked on it, who had contributed to its development. It felt like a warning shot, a prelude to something much worse. Elijah's mind raced, trying to piece together what this could mean. He hadn't told anyone outside the workshop about the device, hadn't even hinted at its existence to the higher-ups. So how did they know? Who could have tipped them off? And then it hit him like a punch to the gut. Malik, the conversation outside the workshop, the sudden avoidance of eye contact, the tension that had been simmering just below the surface. It all made sense now. Feeling sick to his stomach, Elijah went through the motions of his day, the email a dark cloud hanging over him. He tried to focus on the work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Malik, to the possibility that his closest ally had betrayed him. When Malik and Sophia showed up later that evening, ready to dive back into the project, Elijah couldn't hold it in any longer. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Malik looked up, startled. "What's up?" Elijah didn't mince words. "I got an email from the legal department. They're asking questions about the device, questions they shouldn't even know to ask." Sophia's eyes widened, but Malik's expression remained carefully neutral. Too neutral. Elijah's gaze bore into Malik. "Do you know anything about that?" There was a long, uncomfortable silence, and then Malik sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Elijah, there's something you should know." Elijah's heart skipped a beat, dread pooling in his stomach. "What is it?" Malik hesitated, his eyes flicking to Sophia before returning to Elijah. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't want to go behind your back, but..." "But what?" Elijah's voice trembled with barely restrained anger. "Was approached by someone from the company," Malik admitted, his voice low. "They knew about the device, knew we were working on something big. They wanted in." Elijah's head spun, the words barely registering. "They wanted in. What does that even mean?" Malik looked away, guilt etched into his features. "They offered me a deal. They said if I could bring them the device, they cut me in. A big cut, Elijah. Enough to take care of my family, enough to sell us out." Elijah's voice rose, disbelief and betrayal colliding in his chest. "You were going to sell us out, after everything we've been through." Malik winced, but he didn't deny it. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought maybe we could all benefit, that I could get them off our backs and still keep us in the game. But things got complicated." "Complicated," Elijah repeated, his voice a whisper now. He felt like the floor was falling out from under him, like everything he'd worked for was crumbling to dust. "How could you do this, Malik? How could you betray us like this?" Malik opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening, thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. And then, as if the universe wasn't done twisting the knife, Sophia spoke up. "Elijah, there's something else you should know." Elijah turned to her, his heart sinking even further. "What now?" Sophia hesitated, clearly torn, but then she took a deep breath and said, "I knew about it. Malik told me a few days ago." Elijah stared at her, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. You knew." "I didn't want to believe it," Sophia said quickly, her voice full of regret. "I thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding, that we could work it out. I didn't want to hurt you, Elijah, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer." The betrayal was like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He trusted them both, relied on them, and now he didn't know who to trust. He felt like a fool, like he'd been played from the start. Ever had the ground ripped out from under you? Like everything you thought you knew, everything you believed in, was suddenly a lie. That's where Elijah was now, standing in the wreckage of what he thought was a solid partnership, realizing that the very people he trusted the most had been the ones to betray him. Less than break time equals 1.0 / greater than he didn't say anything, didn't know what to say. All he could do was turn and walk out of the workshop, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to soothe the fire burning in his chest. He felt raw, exposed, like a wound that had been torn open and left to bleed. He wandered the streets, his mind a blur of anger, hurt, and confusion. How did it come to this? How had everything gone so wrong? He thought about his mother, about how she'd always told him to trust his instincts, to be careful who he let into his life. Had he ignored those instincts? Or had he just been too blinded by the hope that they were all in this together, that they were a team? But it wasn't just about him. This betrayal had implications far beyond his own hurt feelings. If Malik had been working with the company behind his back, there was no telling what kind of damage had already been done. The device, the project, everything they'd worked for, it was all at risk now. Elijah knew he couldn't afford to fall apart. He had to keep going, had to find a way to salvage what was left of their work. But the thought of going back to the workshop, of facing Malik and Sophia again, it was almost too much to bear. How could he trust them now? How could he trust anyone? He found himself back at the river, the same spot he'd come to the night everything had first started falling apart. The water was dark and still, reflecting city lights like a mirror. Elijah sat down on the bench, staring out at the water, his thoughts churning with a million questions and no answers. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in thought, but eventually the sound of footsteps approached. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Malik sat down beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "I know I messed up," Malik said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I was trying to protect you, protect all of us, but I went about it the wrong way. I'm sorry, Elijah. I really am." Elijah didn't respond, didn't even look at him. He just kept staring out at the water, the weight of Malik's words sinking in. He wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was still something worth salvaging here. But the betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Malik's words hung in the air between them, thick with regret and unspoken apologies. Elijah sat there, staring out at the dark water, the sound of the city muffled in the distance. He wanted to believe Malik, wanted to believe that things could be made right again. But the betrayal had cut too deep. Still, there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the bond they'd built over the years, the trust that, despite everything, still lingered like a faint echo. "Fixing this isn't going to be easy," Elijah finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of everything they'd been through. "It's not just about the project anymore, Malik. It's about trust. Once that's broken," he trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Malik nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm not giving up on this, or on us. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, letting the silence stretch out, the cold breeze biting at his skin. He thought about everything they'd been through, the late nights, the setbacks, the small victories that had kept them going. And then he thought about his mother, still lying in that hospital bed, fighting her own battle. He couldn't afford to let this betrayal destroy everything they'd worked for. They were too close to the finish line. Finally, Elijah sighed and looked over at Malik. "We need to be smarter about this. If they're already onto us, we have to be one step ahead. No more secrets, no more deals behind each other's backs. We either do this together or we don't do it at all." Malik nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Agreed. We're in this together." They stayed there for a while longer, sitting in the quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. And as they sat there, the tension between them began to ease, the sharp edges of their anger and hurt slowly softening into something more manageable. They weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time in days, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, the three of them gathered in the workshop, the air thick with a sense of renewed purpose. Malik and Sophia looked to Elijah, waiting for him to take the lead. Despite everything, they were still a team, and Elijah knew that he had to be the one to guide them through this final stretch. "We need to make this public," Elijah said, his voice firm. "The company thinks they can control us, that they can take our work and twist it to their advantage. But if we go public, if we show the world what we've been working on, they won't be able to bury it. We take control of the narrative." Sophia nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "And we make sure the credit goes where it belongs. This is your idea, Elijah. It's time everyone knows it." Malik, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "I know someone in the media. They're always looking for stories like this. Underdog stories, stories about innovation and fighting against the odds. If we can get them on our side, it could be the break we need." Elijah considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Let's do it. But we have to be careful. If the company gets wind of this before we're ready, they'll try to shut us down." And so the plan was set in motion. They worked tirelessly, preparing a presentation that would not only showcase the device, but also tell the story of their journey, the obstacles they'd faced, the setbacks, the betrayals, and the triumphs. It was a story of perseverance, of refusing to back down in the face of overwhelming odds, and it was a story that Elijah knew would resonate with people far beyond the walls of their company. The day of the presentation arrived sooner than any of them had expected. They stood in a small packed conference room, a mix of journalists, industry insiders, and curious onlookers filling the seats. The air was electric with anticipation, a low hum of murmured conversations filling the space. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was it, the culmination of everything they'd worked for. He glanced over at Malik and Sophia, who gave him encouraging nods. They were ready. And so was he. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent, all eyes on him. He could feel the energy in the air, the curiosity and skepticism, the hope and doubt. It was all there, a tangible force that pressed in on him from all sides. But instead of being overwhelmed by it, Elijah felt a surge of determination. He was ready to tell their story, to show the world what they'd been fighting for. He started with the basics, explaining the concept behind the device, the innovation it represented. But he didn't stop there. He delved into the journey they'd taken to get here, the countless hours of work, the moments of despair, the glimmers of hope. He spoke of the challenges they'd faced, both technical and personal, and the betrayals that had nearly torn them apart. And as he spoke, he could see the crowd leaning in, hanging on his every word. Elijah paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room was silent, the tension palpable. He could see the faces of the audience, a mix of awe and disbelief. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This device is more than just a piece of technology," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to give up, when we refuse to let others define our worth. It's a testament to the power of perseverance, of believing in something even when the world tells you it's impossible." The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that washed over him like a tide. Elijah felt a surge of emotion, a mix of relief and triumph as he stepped back from the podium. He had done it. They had done it. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Just as the applause began to die down, a figure stepped forward from the back of the room. It was the CEO, his face a mask of cold fury. "What do you think you're doing?" the CEO demanded, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation unfolding before them. Elijah stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "We're taking control of our work, of our story. We're not letting you, or anyone else, take that away from us." The CEO sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away from this, from everything we've built together?" "This isn't about walking away," Elijah shot back, his voice firm. "It's about standing up for what's right. We've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let you or anyone else take credit for what we've created." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken challenge between them. But before the CEO could respond, a voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Mr. Williams, I think you should listen to what Elijah has to say." All heads turned to see who had spoken, and there, standing in the back of the room, was one of the company's board members, a man known for his integrity and commitment to innovation. The CEO's face paled slightly, his confidence faltering. The board member stepped forward, addressing the room. "Elijah's right. This company was built on innovation, on pushing boundaries and breaking new ground. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We started prioritizing profits over people, control over creativity. It's time we get back to what made this company great in the first place." The CEO's face tightened, but he said nothing, his hands clenching at his sides. The board member turned to Elijah, a small smile on his face. "Elijah, you and your team have done something incredible here. You've reminded us all of what's truly important, and for that you have my gratitude and my support." The room erupted into applause once more, this time even louder, the sound reverberating off the walls. Elijah felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him as he looked out at the crowd, at Malik and Sophia, at the board member who had just saved their project from certain doom. But the CEO wasn't done. He stepped forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low enough that only Elijah could hear. "You may have won this round, but I'll make sure you regret it." Elijah met his gaze, refusing to back down. "You've already lost," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And it's not just me you're up against. It's everyone in this room, everyone who believes in what we're doing. You can't fight that." The CEO's face twisted in rage, but before he could respond, the board member stepped in, his tone firm. "That's enough, Mr. Williams. It's time to step down." The CEO opened his mouth to argue, but the look on the board member's face left no room for debate. With a final glare at Elijah, the CEO turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. As the door closed behind the CEO, the tension in the room finally began to ease, like a storm passing to reveal clear skies. Elijah stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. They had done it. They had not only saved their project, but had also exposed the truth behind the company's leadership. It was more than a victory. It was a vindication of everything they had fought for. The board member turned to the crowd, his expression calm but resolute. "This company needs to change," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to return to our roots, to the principles that made us a leader in innovation. That starts today, with the recognition of Elijah's work and the importance of fostering creativity and integrity in all that we do." There was another round of applause, more subdued this time, but filled with a deeper sense of respect. Elijah felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Malik standing beside him, his face a mix of relief and apology. "I meant what I said, Elijah," Malik murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I'm sorry for everything." Elijah nodded, the anger and betrayal he had felt earlier now tempered by the gravity of what they had just accomplished. "We've still got a lot of work to do," he said quietly. "But we'll get through it. Together." Sophia joined them, a broad smile on her face. "We did it," she said, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and disbelief. "I can't believe we actually did it." Elijah smiled back, feeling the warmth of their shared victory. "It wasn't easy, but we made it. And now we can finally move forward." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Elijah to offer their congratulations, their admiration evident in their words and expressions. It was a whirlwind of handshakes and pats on the back. But through it all, Elijah remained focused, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the workshop was quiet once more, Elijah found himself standing alone, gazing at the device that had brought them so far. It was more than just a piece of technology. It was a symbol of their journey, of the obstacles they had overcome, and of the power of perseverance. He thought about his mother, about how she had always believed in him, even when he had doubted himself. She was still in the hospital, still fighting her own battle, but he knew that she would be proud of what they had accomplished. He made a silent promise to her that he would continue to fight, not just for this project, but for everything he believed in. Ever feel like you're standing at the edge of something big? Like you've just crossed a threshold and the world is waiting to see what you'll do next? That's where Elijah was now, standing on the brink of a new beginning, with the world at his feet and the future wide open before him. Less than break time equals 1.0s / greater, and the days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The media quickly picked up on the story, and soon Elijah's name was being mentioned in tech circles around the world. The device was hailed as a groundbreaking innovation, a game-changer that had the potential to revolutionize the industry. And for the first time, Elijah found himself at the center of it all, no longer in the shadows, but in the spotlight, where he had always belonged. But it wasn't just about the recognition. With the CEO out of the picture and the board support, Elijah and his team were finally free to push forward with their work without fear of interference. They expanded their team, bringing in new talent, new ideas, and the project began to evolve in ways they had only dreamed of. Malik, true to his word, worked tirelessly to regain Elijah's trust, and slowly the wounds of betrayal began to heal. Their friendship, once strained to the breaking point, grew stronger as they rebuilt what had been broken. Sophia, too, flourished in her role, her sharp mind and unyielding dedication driving the project forward. But even as the project soared to new heights, Elijah never forgot the lessons he had learned along the way. He knew that success wasn't just about the end result. It was about the journey, the people who stood by you, and the integrity with which you pursue your dreams. It was a lesson he carried with him, one that would guide him through the challenges yet to come. Finally, after months of hard work, the day came when they were ready to unveil the final version of the device to the world. It was a moment of triumph, the culmination of everything they had worked for, and as Elijah stood before the assembled crowd, ready to present their creation, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, his colleagues, the board members, the media, and beyond them, the countless people who would be touched by this innovation. And he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the obstacles they had faced, and the strength it had taken to overcome them. This device, Elijah began, his voice steady and clear, isn't just a product of technology. It's a product of perseverance, of believing in something even when the odds are against you. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't come easy. It requires sacrifice, determination, and above all, a refusal to give up. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. But it's also a reminder that success isn't something you achieve alone. It's something you build together, with the people who believe in you, who stand by you through thick and thin. This device is a testament to what can happen when we come together, when we put aside our differences and work toward a common goal. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a ripple of understanding that spread through the room. And so, as we move forward, Elijah continued, I want to thank everyone who has been a part of this journey. This is just the beginning, and I know that together we can achieve even greater things. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of sound that filled the room and reverberated in Elijah's chest. He felt a swell of pride, not just in the device, but in the people who had made it possible. They had come a long way, and the road ahead was still long. But for the first time, Elijah felt ready to face whatever challenges came next. As the event came to a close, Elijah found himself standing off to the side, watching as people mingled and celebrated the success they had all worked so hard for. Malik and Sophia joined him, their faces glowing with pride. "You did it, Elijah," Sophia said, her voice filled with admiration. "We all did." Elijah smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "Yeah, we did." Malik clapped him on the back, a broad grin on his face. "Here's to the future, man. I can't wait to see what we do next." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like anything was possible. But no matter where the road took them, he knew one thing for sure. They would face it together, as a team, and with the lessons they had learned guiding them every step of the way. In the weeks that followed, the success of the device catapulted the company to new heights. The CEO's departure had sent ripples through the industry, and in his place, the board appointed a new leader, one who valued innovation, integrity, and the people behind the ideas. It was a change that revitalized the company, setting the stage for a new era of creativity and growth. Elijah continued to lead the project, but he also took on a new role, one that allowed him to mentor younger engineers, sharing the lessons he had learned along the way. He became a source of inspiration for many, a living example of what it meant to persevere in the face of adversity. And as the years passed, Elijah never forgot where he came from or the journey that had brought him to where he was. He remained grounded, always remembering the importance of humility, of staying true to oneself, and of never forgetting the people who helped along the way. One day, as he was preparing for a presentation to a group of new engineers, he received a call from the hospital. His mother had finally woken up. Elijah rushed to her side, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. When he arrived, he found her sitting up in bed, looking weak but alert. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she reached out a hand, which he took with trembling fingers. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're awake." She smiled, her eyes filled with a love that had never wavered, even in the darkest of times. "Elijah," she said softly, her voice raspy but full of warmth. "I knew you'd be here." They talked for hours, catching up on everything that had happened, and Elijah told her all about the project, the struggles, the triumphs. She listened intently, pride shining in her eyes as he recounted the journey that had brought him to this point. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You've done so much, accomplished so much. Your father would have been proud too." "You were always there for me, even when things got tough," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed his mother's hand gently, as if trying to convey all the gratitude he felt through that simple gesture. "You taught me how to keep going, how to fight for what I believe in. Everything I've done, it's because of you." His mother's eyes glistened with tears, and she smiled, a soft, warm smile that seemed to light up the room. "You always had it in you, Elijah. I just helped you see it. And look at you now. You've done more than I ever dreamed." Elijah shook his head, a bittersweet smile on his face. "I just wanted to make you proud, Mom." "You've done that and more," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet pride that made Elijah's heart swell. "But remember, it's not just about what you achieve. It's about how you achieve it. You've shown integrity, compassion, and strength. That's what really matters." Elijah nodded, her words resonating deep within him. He had been so focused on the success of the project, on proving himself to the world, that he sometimes forgot the values that had guided him there. Hearing it from his mother, the person who had shaped him into who he was reaffirmed everything he believed in. They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the beeping of the monitors the only sound in the room. Elijah could feel the weight of the past few years lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of peace. It wasn't just the project that had succeeded. It was the journey itself, the lessons learned, the relationships forged and mended. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Elijah," his mother said softly, breaking the silence. "But don't forget to take time for yourself, for the people you care about. Life isn't just about work. It's about balance, about finding happiness in the small moments." Elijah smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle in his heart. "I will, Mom, I promise." He stayed with her until she drifted off to sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. As he watched her, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for her recovery, but for the strength she had given him, the wisdom she had imparted over the years. She had been his rock, his guiding light, and he knew that no matter where life took him, he would carry her lessons with him. In the days that followed, Elijah found himself reflecting on his journey, the winding road that had led him to this moment of triumph. The project had been a success, but more than that, it had been a catalyst for change, not just in the company, but in his own life. He had faced betrayal, adversity, and countless setbacks, but he had emerged stronger, more resolute in his values. He returned to the workshop, where the team was already hard at work on the next phase of their project. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of excitement and anticipation for what lay ahead. Malik and Sophia greeted him with smiles, their camaraderie stronger than ever. "Elijah," Malik said, walking over with a grin. "Glad to see you back. We've got some new ideas we're playing with. Can't wait to get your thoughts." Elijah chuckled, feeling a surge of pride as he looked around at the team they had built. "I'm ready," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's see what you've got." They gathered around the workbench, tossing around ideas, brainstorming new concepts, and refining old ones. The work was challenging, but it was the kind of challenge that excited Elijah, the kind that pushed him to think bigger, to innovate further. But no matter how engrossed he became in the work, he always kept his mother's words in mind. He made time for the things that mattered, his family, his friends, the small moments of joy that made life meaningful. He learned to find balance, to appreciate the journey as much as the destination. Years passed, and the company flourished under the new leadership, with Elijah at the forefront of innovation. His name became synonymous with breakthrough ideas, with a commitment to ethics and integrity that set him apart in the industry. But despite his success, he remained humble, always remembering the lessons that had guided him through his darkest moments. One day, as he was preparing to give a speech at a conference, a young engineer approached him, wide-eyed and eager. "Mr. Elijah, can I ask you something?" Elijah smiled warmly, recognizing the nervous energy of someone just starting out in their career. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The young engineer hesitated for a moment, then said, "How did you do it? How did you get through all those challenges and come out on top?" Elijah paused, considering the question. He thought about the long nights, the betrayals, the moments of doubt. He thought about his mother, her unwavering support, and the strength he had drawn from the people around him. "It wasn't easy," Elijah said finally, his voice steady and reflective. "There were times when I wanted to give up, when it seemed like the odds were too great. But I kept going because I believed in what I was doing, and because I had people who believed in me." He looked at the young engineer, seeing a bit of himself in those eager eyes. "The key is to stay true to yourself, no matter what. Don't let others define your worth or dictate your path. Keep pushing, keep learning, and most importantly, keep your integrity. Success is about more than just what you achieve. It's about how you achieve it." The young engineer nodded, clearly absorbing every word. "Thank you, Mr. Elijah. I won't forget that." Elijah smiled, clapping the engineer on the shoulder. "Good. Now go out there and make something great." As the young engineer walked away, Elijah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had come full circle from the struggles and doubts of his early career to a place where he could inspire and guide others. It was a journey that had shaped him in ways he never could have imagined, and one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he stepped onto the stage to deliver his speech, Elijah took a moment to look out at the crowd, at the faces turned up to him, waiting to hear what he had to say. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. He had faced the worst and come out stronger. He had built something lasting, something meaningful, and he had done it all with integrity and heart. And that, he realized, was the greatest triumph of all. That's it, everyone. How did Elijah's journey of innovation and integrity resonate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Want more stories of perseverance and justice? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay inspired. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries.